Morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to AP US History as we look today at the growing successes but also growing radicalization of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. Now, in the early 1960s, Mississippi was the poorest state in the Union. 86% of all non-white families lived below the national poverty line. In addition, the state had a terrible record of black voting rights violations. In the 1950s, Mississippi was 55% black, but only 5% of adult blacks were registered to vote. Some counties did not have a single registered black voter. In 1960, the NAACP and SNCC began to work to register black voters in Mississippi and to teach them nonviolent methods of protest like the sit-in. Other activists were organized by an older civil rights group, the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, who had been formed during World War II. As the 1960s progressed, more and more civil rights workers began to go into rural Mississippi. Particularly as the movement became popular, young, socially conscious white Northerners began to go south too, especially college students on their summer vacations, which led the Northern media and middle-class white Northern parents to increasingly pay attention. As in the summer of 1961, CORE helped set up a freedom ride through the Deep South to protest the continued segregation of many Southern buses in violation of Supreme Court orders that they integrate. So in the summer of 1961, 13 young people, 6 of them white and 7 of them black, got on 2 buses in Washington, D.C., where buses were integrated. The white riders sat in the back, the black riders sat in the front, and they set off through the South, heading for Louisiana, challenging Jim Crow laws wherever they could, with black riders drinking from white water fountains, white riders using the colored bathrooms, and so forth. In Alabama, the buses were attacked. One was even firebombed. Many of the Freedom Riders were beaten up, others prepared to go home. But more civil rights activists, led by SNCC members and other college students from Nashville, went south to continue the freedom ride. In Mississippi, many of the riders were arrested. But when photographs of the bombed-out bus and stories about mass arrests appeared in newspapers, President Kennedy ordered the desegregation of interstate bus travel in accordance with existing Supreme Court rulings, although he did allow Mississippi to quietly arrest the Freedom Riders when they arrived there, on the grounds they were disturbing the peace. But this did prevent violence in Mississippi. But in summers to come, SNCC organized more freedom rides, many of which also had white college students participating too. In 1962, James Meredith, a black Air Force veteran, won the right to enroll in the University of Mississippi, to transfer in from an all-black college. And furthermore, he was given protection by federal marshals. But on the day he was to enter the school, Governor Ross Barnett and a group of white protesters tried to block him. Riots broke out that killed 2 people and injured 160. President Kennedy once again went on television and addressed the nation, saying Americans could disagree with the law but could not disobey it. And James Meredith began attending classes and graduated the next year in August of 1963, and from there he went on to law school and remained involved in the civil rights movement for the rest of his life. But a couple months before his graduation, in June of 1963, the head of the Mississippi NAACP, Medgar Evers, who had played a big part in getting him into Ole Miss, was shot and killed. But integration of Southern universities would continue. In April of 1963, President Kennedy ordered the Army to enforce the integration of the University of Alabama. This integration was opposed by the governor of Alabama, George Wallace, previously viewed as moderate by Southern standards, but now feeling he had to take a more extreme segregationist stance to maintain his popularity. he symbolically blocked the schoolhouse door at the University of Alabama to keep 2 black students from registering for classes. Kennedy then federalized the Alabama National Guard and had their commander order Wallace to stand aside, which he did. And the 2 black students enrolled for their classes and began attending later that year. But there was much to be done. In 1963, a number of activists, including Martin Luther King Jr. and other members of the SCLC, began sponsoring more protest marches, particularly in Birmingham, Alabama, described by some as the most segregated city in the nation. Children even joined the marches, middle school, high school age children, who, if they were arrested, wouldn't cost their family the maid breadwinner's income. There was a lot of controversy in Birmingham how to respond. Indeed, the city commission was voted out of office, and new city leaders were elected, but the old commissioners refused to step down, including the Commissioner of Public Safety, Bull Connor, in charge of the police and the fire department, and he responded by turning police dogs loose on peaceful marchers and blasting them with fire hoses. Fire hoses with enough pressure to shoot water several stories up into a burning building, or at close range to blast the bark off a tree, or the skin off a protester. Photographs and film of this violence showed up in national newspapers and magazines and on national television, causing anger and embarrassment in the United States. It showed up in the international press as well. The Soviet Union made much of America's inequality, and the newly independent nations in Africa, part of the Third World the United States hoped to influence during the Cold War, were not particularly impressed either. President Kennedy, horrified by these images, now tried to put the promises he'd made about supporting civil rights into action, going on television, and along with his brother, the Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, announced he would ask Congress for a major civil rights bill. And to keep pressure on Congress and Kennedy, King and the SCLC and SNCC and CORE and the NAACP organized a march on Washington, called it the March for Jobs and Freedom, in August of 1963, asking for political and economic opportunities, equality. They hoped 100,000 people might show up. 200,000 came, and all were peaceful. There were many programs and speeches. The most famous today, of course, is that given by Martin Luther King Jr. on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, in which he declared he had a dream that the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners could sit down together at the table of brotherhood. In January 1964, 3/4 of the states ratified the 24th Amendment, making it illegal to make the payment of a tax the basis for voting in state or national elections, effectively banning the poll tax. And shortly afterwards, President Johnson and Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Johnson in particular using the martyrdom of President Kennedy to put pressure on Congress to support Kennedy's Civil Rights Bill. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 banned all public segregation and workplace segregation based on race, sex, or national origin, and gave the Justice Department the power to enforce this legislation. 1964 was Freedom Summer. Thousands of civil rights workers organized by SNCC streamed into the Deep South in a massive voter registration drive during this presidential election year. And they were fairly successful. Within 5 years, 66.5% of adult blacks in Mississippi would be registered to vote, higher than the national average, and much, much higher than it had been 4 years before. Black and white civil rights workers in Mississippi, knowing the local Democratic Party did not support them, formed their own Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which sent 4 delegates to the Democratic National Convention. There was a huge protest by the regular Democratic Party from Mississippi. As a compromise, 2 of the 4 members of the Democratic Mississippi Freedom Party, were allowed to sit in the convention. But in the short run, Freedom Summer would be hard and violent. In June of 1964, 3 civil rights workers, 2 white and 1 black, went to investigate a firebombing at a black church. They were arrested for traffic violations and never seen alive again. 6 weeks later, a federal investigation found their bodies under a dam. The 2 white men had been shot through the chest, the black man beaten to death. The FBI arrested 21 local white men, including the sheriff, but none were convicted by a jury of their peers. But this did not stop the civil rights movement. The next year, 1965, there was a major voter registration drive in Alabama where black people were half the state population but only 1% of registered voters. In a series of marches, because it took 3 tries to make it all the way, black and white civil rights activists, both local and from around the nation, led by Martin Luther King Jr., marched 50 miles from Selma, Alabama, to the state capital of Montgomery. Along the way, they were attacked by police dogs, sprayed with high-pressure water hoses, beaten by mounted police with nightsticks, and whipped, both painful and very symbolic to the descendants of slaves. They were attacked with tear gas. Hundreds were arrested. In addition to a number of Southern black protesters being killed, a Unitarian minister from Boston was killed during the march, and a Klansman later killed a white woman from Detroit who had been involved. But in response to this violence, which was once again seen on TV, Lyndon Johnson pushed the Voting Rights Act through Congress and signed it into law August 6, 1965. This Voting Rights Act banned the literacy test and sent federal registrars into the South to make sure everyone had a chance to register to vote. It also required any change to state voting registration rules to be approved by the Justice Department, at least in places with a record of civil rights violations, singling out many counties and some entire states in the South and a few counties in the North as well. Federal oversight of voter registration rules, however, was overturned by the Supreme Court in the 21st century. A number of states did soon begin to change their voter registration requirements. Johnson City, Tennessee, only desegregated schools fully under a court order in 1965, although there had been a gradual plan to desegregate, starting with elementary schools, 1 grade at a time. This meant that the colored high school and other colored schools in Johnson City were shut down because no white parent was willing to let their children go to a black school. East Tennessee State University had desegregated back in 1956, admitting its first black student, Eugene Caruthers, as a graduate student in music. He later went on to direct the high school band at Langston High School, its last few years in operation, and then went on to be assistant band director at Science Hill High School once it was integrated in 1965. But many black people were not entirely satisfied by what they saw as the slow pace of nonviolent protest. A few opposed working with white people at all. And many of these court cases and other protests were fairly middle-class operations. For poorer black people, many felt things weren't changing much. And some would argue the nonviolent period of the civil rights movement ended in 1965. Because just a few days after the Voting Rights Act was passed, riots broke out in Watts, Los Angeles, angry about housing discrimination and especially mistreatment by the police. Black people in Watts looted and burned their way primarily through their own neighborhoods in town. The new slogan was Black Power. And when riots began in 1967 in Detroit, leading to 48 deaths, and in Newark, New Jersey, leading to 25 deaths, the rioters chanted, "Burn, baby, burn." And again, there were those who said that Martin Luther King was too conciliatory. Malcom X, in the late 1950s, early 1960s, was a black nationalist in the Nation of Islam. Malcom X, of course, was not the name he was born with. He'd been born Malcolm Little, but declared that nobody in Africa was named Little. It had been forced on his ancestors during the time of slavery, and he rejected his slave name in adopting X instead. And the Nation of Islam, to which he belonged, is an extremist black nationalist group with teachings based on those of Islam, but many other Muslims would not regard them as truly Islamic. Islam, for example, would like all races and peoples around the world to become Muslim. The Nation of Islam, however, believes that non-black people are actually demons in disguise, and that Muhammad was not the last prophet for Islam, but there have been prophets since, including a black preacher in Chicago in the early 20th century. And the Nation of Islam is not always opposed to violence. Although Malcom X would later renounce extreme black nationalism and renounce violence after a visit to Mecca, following which he renamed himself again Haj Malik El-Shabazz. But after beginning to criticize extreme black nationalism and the use of violence, he himself was murdered, probably by men from the Nation of Islam itself. And even the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee began to question its nonviolent roots, taking up the slogan of Black Power, particularly under the leadership of Stokely Carmichael, who'd been a member of SNCC since its earliest days in 1960, had worked on the Freedom Rides since 1961, and 1966 became chairman of SNCC, at which point he promised that Black Power would smash everything Western civilization has created, and helped to popularize the slogan that black is beautiful, glorifying distinctive clothing and appearance for black people, saying that black people should take pride in their own natural appearance. They should not have to straighten their hair or bleach their skin to try to fit in. Black is beautiful in its own right. Stokely Carmichael was eventually named honorary prime minister of the Black Panthers. Now, in times, he backed away a little bit. He did pledge to continue voter registration drives in Mississippi after James Meredith, Ole Miss's first black student, was shot in 1966 while leading his own protest march. He survived the shooting, but again was badly injured. And Carmichael later said, too, that by Black Power smashing everything Western civilization had created was to be through economic power, not unlike Marcus Garvey's separatism, and not through violence. But many people saw this as frightening. There were some black civil rights activists who felt he was counterproductive. And there were also mixed feelings about the Black Panthers, who had a military-style organization, carried weapons to protect themselves from white violence, at one point marched into the California State House with shotguns to protest restrictions on black people's constitutional right to bear arms. They fought with the police, sometimes committed robberies and other crimes, partly to fund themselves. But they also were a community organization, with sponsoring community outreach programs, like a free breakfast program that they claim fed 20,000 children in 1 year alone. They had programs for education, for public health, at least for a time. Eventually, though, many of their leaders were arrested or killed by law enforcement. In 1968, sanitation workers, street sweepers, garbage collectors, and so forth in Memphis began to strike for better wages. And this soon was seen as a civil rights issue as well, because most of them were black. The NAACP and Martin Luther King Jr. came to town to support them, King arriving in March of 1968. And they urged a one-day general strike of all black workers in support of the striking sanitation workers. King led a group of 5,000 peaceful demonstrators on a march through town, but a small Black Power group known as the Invaders were there too. They began looting and rioting. Martin Luther King was criticized because it seemed he was not in control of the situation. To prove himself and to continue supporting the strike, he planned another march. But on April 4th, 1968, he was shot by an assassin and died, leading to riots across the country. A tragic memorial to a man who had always preached nonviolence, although who was himself beginning to question its continuing efficacy by this time. Now, shortly after this, the mayor of Memphis did agree to give the black sanitation workers a small raise and to recognize their union, and the strike ended. But anger did not. Still, in 1968, Congress passed another Civil Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act of 1968, also known as the Fair Housing Act, which banned many types of discrimination in housing, including steering, a practice of many realtors of encouraging members of a particular race or ethnic group to move into a neighborhood of people like them. And perhaps most importantly, it banned redlining, a practice by many banks of refusing to give loans to people living in or hoping to buy property in certain areas, officially based on poverty and violence in those areas, but typically really to deny loans to black people. And the FHA would begin to enforce those rules. But just as black people were winning many legal victories, the violence of some radicals was alienating many people who had once supported the civil rights movement. The riots that broke out after King's death doing this in particular. Although, of course, those followed the major riots the year before in Detroit and Newark, those in Watts 3 years earlier. So support for the civil rights movement, support for major civil rights laws, began in some ways to decline in the late 1960s. Still, some black people were quietly succeeding, finding better jobs, being elected as mayors and governors, and members of Congress. As black members of Congress even formed a Congressional Black Caucus in 1971 for both Republicans and Democrats who were black to work for the improvement of the black condition in Congress. By 1972, almost half of Southern classrooms were integrated, although in the South and some other places, integration was often accomplished, or at least sometimes accomplished, through the controversial practice of busing students long distances out of their home school zones into others, particularly busing black students from predominantly black areas into predominantly white ones. So while many of the problems of the past had been solved or at least addressed on paper, there were many problems that remained.